On January 9, 2026, the Department of Justice, operating through the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, did something with no precedent in American history. It initiated a criminal investigation into a sitting Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, the man responsible for guiding America's monetary policy, the man who sets interest rates affecting everything from your mortgage to your retirement account. The official reason? Allegations that Powell lied to Congress about a building renovation project. The real reason? That depends on who you ask, but the effect was immediate and undeniable. 2 days later, on January 11th, Powell did something extraordinary. He released a video statement directly to the American public. He didn't speak from behind a podium at a press conference. He looked into a camera and accused the Trump administration of using criminal threats to pressure the Federal Reserve. He called the investigation unprecedented. He said the threat of charges was a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public rather than following the preferences of the president. That matters. Here's why. The Federal Reserve is supposed to be independent. That independence is baked into how American monetary policy has functioned for over a century. The Fed chair isn't supposed to lower interest rates because a president wants them lower. The Fed chair is supposed to look at economic data, inflation numbers, employment figures, growth projections, and make decisions based on what the economy actually needs. When that independence erodes, when political pressure starts dictating monetary policy, history shows us what happens. Inflation spirals, markets destabilize, economic credibility collapses. And now, for the first time in American history, a president's Justice Department has threatened to criminally indict the nation's chief central banker. Powell's response was defiant. Public service sometimes requires standing firm in the face of threats, he said. He announced he had no intention of resigning. He made clear the investigation would not change how the Fed operates. He would continue serving with integrity and a commitment to serving the American people. But while Powell was projecting resolve, markets were telling a different story. S&P 500 futures dropped 0.5%. Gold surged 2% to a record $4,580 per ounce. Silver jumped 4%. The dollar weakened against the euro, the Swiss franc, and other major currencies. Bitcoin ticked up 1.7% to around $92,000. Investors were doing what investors do when they sense institutional instability. They were fleeing to safe havens. Krishna Guha, the head of global policy at Evercore ISI, one of the most respected financial research firms, called the situation deeply disturbing. He warned of increased volatility ahead. Other economists echoed his concerns. Mohamed El-Arian noted that Powell's defiant response might actually draw more marketplace attention to the crisis rather than calming it. So what exactly is Powell accused of? The allegations center on the Federal Reserve's $2.5 billion renovation of its headquarters, the Mariner S. Eccles Building. This is a historic structure overlooking the National Mall, built in the 1930s. The renovation was announced in the early 2020s to modernize aging infrastructure, updating electrical systems, removing asbestos, improving ventilation, reinforcing the structure for modern security requirements. Initial cost estimates came in around $1.9 billion. By 2025, that figure had ballooned to $2.5 billion. The reasons were familiar to anyone who's watched a major construction project: inflation, supply chain disruptions, scope changes, unexpected structural issues. In June 2025, Powell testified before the Senate Banking Committee about the project. He described the renovations as necessary maintenance. He characterized recent changes as minor adjustments designed to streamline construction and avoid delays. He assured lawmakers that the project adhered to all oversight protocols. Here's where the trouble starts. Documents submitted by the Fed to the National Capital Planning Commission told a different story. They revealed additions that critics called extravagant: a VIP private dining area, premium marble finishes, upgraded elevators, decorative water features, a landscaped roof terrace. These were elements Powell hadn't emphasized in his testimony. His characterization of changes as minor efficiencies didn't quite match up with plans for private dining rooms and decorative gardens. In July 2025, Representative Anna Paulina Luna, a Republican from Florida and a vocal Trump ally, submitted a criminal referral to the Department of Justice. She accused Powell of perjury on 2 counts: his Senate testimony and a separate communication to OMB Director Russell Vought, where he allegedly downplayed cost overruns. Chairman Powell knowingly misled both Congress and executive branch officials about the true nature of a taxpayer-funded project, Luna stated. That same month, something else happened that added fuel to the controversy. President Trump himself toured the renovation site with Powell. According to reports, Trump was shown the project firsthand, and shortly afterward, OMB Director Russ Vought sent a letter to the Fed implying that Powell's testimony had been misleading or incomplete. Federal Housing Finance Agency Director Bill Pulte, another Trump ally, formally requested that the DOJ investigate, calling Powell's remarks deceptive and suggesting they were designed to obscure the true nature of federal spending. Now, criminal referrals happen in Washington all the time. Most go nowhere. Members of Congress refer political opponents to the Justice Department with regularity, and the vast majority of those referrals die quiet deaths in some prosecutor's inbox. What made this one different was what happened next. The referral landed on the desk of Jeanine Pirro. This is the former Fox News host, the longtime Trump ally, who had been appointed U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. By November 2025, Pirro's office had approved the investigation, and in January 2026, grand jury subpoenas were issued. This is important context. The investigation wasn't initiated by some independent prosecutor following evidence wherever it led. It was initiated by a Trump appointee based on a referral from a Trump ally, targeting an official Trump had repeatedly and publicly criticized for not cutting interest rates fast enough. President Trump has been clear about his frustration with Powell. He's called him not very good at his job. He's accused him of gross incompetence. He's publicly demanded aggressive interest rate cuts to stimulate the economy, boost the housing market, and support his broader economic agenda. Powell has resisted, arguing that rate decisions should be based on inflation data and economic conditions, not political preferences. When asked about the investigation, Trump denied orchestrating it for rate-related purposes. "I wouldn't even think of doing it that way," he told NBC. "What should pressure him is the fact that rates are far too high." That statement is worth pausing on. The president simultaneously denies using the investigation as pressure while arguing that high rates should pressure Powell. He's saying the quiet part out loud, just through a different mechanism. But let's be fair here. There are people who believe this investigation is legitimate. They argue that a $2.5 billion taxpayer-funded project deserves scrutiny. They point to the documented discrepancies between Powell's testimony and the planning documents. They say Congress has a right to know exactly what the Federal Reserve is doing with public money, and if Powell misled lawmakers, that's a serious matter regardless of political context. The Federal Housing Finance Agency Director, Bill Pulte, has echoed calls for scrutiny, labeling Powell's remarks as deceptive. OMB Director Russ Vought sent a letter in July 2025 implying Powell's statements were misleading or incomplete. Conservative media outlets like Fox News have highlighted the referral's merits, framing it as exposing lavish spending amid national debt concerns. This counterargument deserves acknowledgement. Government officials shouldn't mislead Congress. Cost overruns on public projects should face examination. If Powell downplayed luxury features in taxpayer-funded renovations, that's a legitimate concern. But here's the part that critics can't explain away: timing. The investigation intensified precisely as Trump's frustration with Powell reached fever pitch. The subpoenas arrived while Powell was resisting pressure to cut rates more aggressively. The probe is being led by an administration ally who owes her position to the president. The criminal referral came from a congressman who openly supports Trump's economic agenda. These facts don't prove the investigation is baseless, but they raise questions about whether a building renovation is really what this is about. Powell certainly doesn't think so. His video statement made that clear. This unprecedented action should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure, he said. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public interest, not according to the preferences of the president. And here's where we need to understand what's really at stake. The Federal Reserve was established in 1913 with a specific purpose: to create a central bank that could manage monetary policy free from short-term political pressures. This wasn't an accident of history. It was a deliberate design choice based on hard experience. Before the Fed existed, America experienced regular financial panics, crashes in 1873, 1893, 1907, that devastated ordinary people's savings and threw the economy into chaos. Politicians, responding to immediate pressures, often made choices that felt good in the short term but created catastrophic consequences later. The Fed was supposed to be different. It was supposed to take the long view, to make unpopular decisions when necessary, to prioritize economic stability over political expedience. That independence has been tested before. In the 1970s, President Nixon pressured Federal Reserve Chair Arthur Burns to expand the money supply ahead of the 1972 election. Burns complied. The result was stagflation, simultaneous high inflation and high unemployment that plagued the American economy for years. Average inflation hit 9% annually and peaked at 12% by 1974. The economic pain was severe and widespread. That episode became a cautionary tale. It demonstrated what happens when the Fed becomes a tool of presidential politics rather than an independent institution. It showed that short-term political gains often come with devastating long-term economic costs. Now compare that to what's happening today. No sitting Federal Reserve Chair has ever faced a criminal investigation while in office. No president has ever used the Justice Department to threaten indictment against the nation's central banker. This isn't just unusual, it's genuinely unprecedented. The investigation has triggered reactions across the political spectrum. Republican Senator Tom Tillis, a member of the Senate Banking Committee, called it an unprecedented attack and vowed to block any Federal Reserve nominees until the matter resolves. If there were any remaining doubt whether advisors within the Trump administration are actively pushing to end the independence of the Federal Reserve, Tillis said, there should now be none. That's a Republican senator saying that, not a Democrat, a member of Trump's own party. Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren was even more direct, calling it a corrupt takeover attempt and urging the Senate to reject any Trump nominees to the Fed. A senior House Republican, speaking anonymously to Politico, expressed shock. Will they stop at nothing? This is setting a standard that will haunt them for a generation. Former Fed Vice Chair Donald Cohn warned that Trump will do anything to get control of the Fed, and bad things happen when that occurs. He described the probe as part of a campaign to subordinate the central bank to presidential control. But not everyone is critical. Some Trump supporters view the investigation as long overdue accountability. On social media platforms like X, posts from Trump's base express satisfaction with the probe. Bye-bye Jerome Powell, reads one. Others call for handcuffs over perceived mismanagement. GOP hardliners have cheered the move as fascinating and aligned with efforts to hold the Fed accountable for what they see as policy failures. This division reflects the broader polarization of American political life. The same set of facts, a criminal investigation into the Fed chair over renovation testimony, means completely different things depending on which political lens you view it through. For Trump critics, it's weaponization of the Justice Department against an independent institution. For Trump supporters, it's finally holding a powerful official accountable for misleading Congress. And make no mistake, some Trump supporters are celebrating openly. On social media platforms like X, the reaction from parts of Trump's base has been triumphant. Posts with phrases like, "Bye-bye Jerome Powell," have circulated widely. Others have called for Powell to face handcuffs over what they view as mismanagement and deception. Conservative commentators have framed the investigation as a victory for accountability and transparency. This celebratory tone extends beyond anonymous social media accounts. Some GOP hardliners in Congress have described the probe as fascinating and long overdue. They argue that the Federal Reserve has operated with insufficient oversight for too long, and that Powell specifically has failed in his duties, both in managing the renovation project and in his broader monetary policy decisions. The Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank with significant influence in Trump's orbit, has published commentary labeling Powell the worst Fed chair in history for policies they claim fueled inflation and market instability. From this perspective, the investigation isn't political interference. It's appropriate scrutiny of a public official who has failed the American people. The truth is probably more complicated than either narrative suggests, but regardless of interpretation, the consequences are real. Powell's term as Fed chair expires on May 15, 2026. That's 4 months away. Even if the investigation produces no charges, and many legal analysts think it won't, it creates pressure during a crucial period. It signals to Powell and to any potential successor that resistance to presidential preferences carries risks. It sends what Greg Ip of the Wall Street Journal called a chilling message to future Fed chairs about what happens when you defy the White House. And that brings us to the question of what comes next. Names are already circulating as potential Powell replacements. Kevin Hassett, Trump's former economic advisor, is frequently mentioned. He's been vocal about favoring more aggressive rate cuts and aligning monetary policy more closely with administration priorities. Kevin Warsh, a former Fed governor, is another possibility. More hawkish on inflation, but potentially more amenable to White House input. Rick Reeder, the chief investment officer at BlackRock, has also been mentioned as a market-oriented choice who might reduce political friction. Each of these potential successors would bring different approaches to the Fed, but the broader concern isn't about any individual's policy preferences. It's about the precedent being set. If a president can use criminal investigations to pressure the Fed chair, if resistance to White House demands carries the threat of prosecution, then the Fed's independence becomes dependent on presidential goodwill. That's not independence at all. The implications extend beyond American borders. The Federal Reserve doesn't just manage U.S. monetary policy. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. Fed decisions ripple through global financial markets. International investors hold trillions in U.S. Treasury bonds precisely because they trust American institutions to remain stable and predictable. When that trust erodes, when political interference appears to compromise the Fed's independence, it affects confidence in American economic governance worldwide. European observers have taken note. Euronews reported that Powell has become the latest perceived adversary facing administration scrutiny, suggesting that similar tactics could inspire actions in other democracies. When the world's leading economic power appears to subordinate its central bank to political control, it sends a message to governments everywhere about what's possible and what's acceptable. Already, we're seeing signs of concern in financial markets. The dollar's weakness against major currencies reflects investor uncertainty. Gold's surge to record highs suggests flight to safe haven assets. Treasury yields have adjusted amid fears of forced rate cuts. These aren't panic responses. Markets haven't collapsed, but they're warning signs. They indicate that sophisticated investors are pricing in political risk to American monetary policy in ways they didn't before. This situation also connects to broader legal questions about presidential power over independent agencies. The Trump administration has been aggressive in asserting executive authority over entities traditionally insulated from direct White House control. The same administration that launched this investigation into Powell has also pursued the removal of Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, citing alleged mortgage fraud in her personal finances. The Lisa Cook case deserves attention because it reveals a pattern. In September 2025, the DOJ opened a criminal investigation into Cook, alleging she committed mortgage fraud by listing multiple properties as primary residences to secure better interest rates. Cook's lawyers have called the investigation politically motivated, noting that Trump had previously sought her removal from the Fed board. The case is now before the Supreme Court, with arguments scheduled for later this month, focusing on whether the president has authority to fire Fed governors. If the court rules in the administration's favor, it would fundamentally reshape the balance of power between the executive branch and the Federal Reserve. Presidents have long criticized Fed chairs. That's nothing new. But the legal architecture has always limited what they could actually do about it. The Federal Reserve Act's for-cause removal protections were designed precisely to prevent presidents from firing central bankers who refuse to follow political orders. Recent Supreme Court decisions have chipped away at similar protections for other independent agencies. A ruling expanding presidential removal power over the Fed would represent a dramatic shift, potentially making Fed officials accountable to the White House in ways they never have been before. If the Supreme Court sides with the administration, it would suggest that Fed officials serve at presidential pleasure more than previously understood. Combined with the criminal investigation into Powell, it would represent a coordinated effort to bring the Fed under tighter executive control. The historical parallels are concerning. Countries that have subordinated their central banks to political control typically experience negative economic consequences. Turkey under President Erdogan provides a recent example. Erdogan pressured the Turkish central bank to keep interest rates artificially low despite rising inflation. The result was a currency crisis, with the lira losing massive value and Turkish citizens seeing their purchasing power evaporate. America's situation is different in important ways. The dollar's reserve currency status, the depth of U.S. financial markets, and the country's broader institutional framework provide buffers that Turkey lacks. But the underlying dynamic is similar. When political leaders prioritize short-term goals over sound monetary policy, economic damage often follows. The investigation also raises questions about the Justice Department's own independence. Attorney General Pam Bondi has emphasized that investigating abuses of taxpayer dollars is a priority, but critics argue that selecting which abuses to investigate inevitably involves discretion that can be wielded politically. The fact that this investigation targets someone Trump has publicly feuded with, at a moment when Trump wants policy changes Powell has resisted, makes the timing suspicious regardless of the allegation's merits. Justice Department spokesperson Chad Gilmartin declined to comment specifically on the Powell investigation, citing standard practice. But the investigation's existence is itself a statement. Grand jury subpoenas don't issue themselves. Someone made decisions at multiple levels to pursue this case with this timing against this target. Senator Tillis pointed directly at this concern. It is now the independence and credibility of the Department of Justice that are in question, he said. When a Republican senator questions whether the Justice Department is acting independently, that's a significant marker of how far this situation has deviated from normal institutional functioning. So where does this leave us? Jerome Powell remains at his post, at least for now. He stated clearly that he won't resign under pressure and won't allow the investigation to alter Fed policy. His defiance has been consistent with his previous responses to presidential criticism. He's maintained that the Fed operates based on evidence and economic conditions, not political preferences. But defiance has limits. Powell's term expires in May. Even if he serves out his chairmanship, even if no charges materialize, the investigation creates institutional damage that will outlast his tenure. Future Fed chairs will know what happened to Powell. They'll understand that resisting a president carries risks that previous chairs never faced. That knowledge will inevitably influence behavior, even if unconsciously. Markets will be watching closely. Every Fed decision between now and May will be analyzed not just for its economic merits, but for signs of whether the investigation is affecting policy. If rates move in directions Trump favors, observers will question whether political pressure played a role. If they don't, Trump's criticism will likely intensify. Congress may attempt to respond. Senator Tillis has already threatened to block Fed nominees, and bipartisan concern about Fed independence could translate into legislative action. But in a divided Congress, passing laws to strengthen Fed protections would be difficult. More likely, the political battles will continue through confirmation fights and oversight hearings rather than new legislation. The Supreme Court's ruling in the Lisa Cook case could reshape the entire landscape. If the court grants presidents broader authority to remove Fed officials, it would represent a fundamental shift in the balance of power. Powell might not be directly affected, his chair term ends soon regardless, but the precedent would matter enormously for whoever comes next. Meanwhile, the investigation itself continues. Grand jury proceedings are secret, so we won't know much about what evidence is being examined or what witnesses are being called. The possibility of indictment remains, even if many legal analysts consider it unlikely given the thinness of the underlying allegations. An indictment, should it occur, would represent an unprecedented escalation, the criminal prosecution of a sitting central bank chair for testimony about a building project. The economic implications depend heavily on how this unfolds. If the investigation fizzles without charges, if Powell serves out his term, if his successor maintains institutional independence, the damage may prove temporary. Markets might eventually price out the political risk premium currently affecting dollar and treasury valuations. But if the investigation leads to charges, if Powell is forced out early, if his successor proves more compliant with White House preferences, the consequences could be severe and lasting. Politicized monetary policy tends to produce worse economic outcomes: higher inflation, greater instability, reduced investor confidence. These are the typical results when central banks lose their independence. The American economy has benefited enormously from having a credible, independent Federal Reserve. When the Fed speaks, markets listen because they trust that Fed officials are making decisions based on economic analysis rather than political calculation. That trust took decades to build. It could erode much faster. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. The investigation could produce charges or quietly disappear. Powell could serve out his term or resign under pressure. Congress could act or remain gridlocked. The Supreme Court could expand or limit presidential power over the Fed. Markets could stabilize or continue pricing in political risk. But certain things are already clear. A line has been crossed. A precedent has been set. For the first time in American history, a sitting Federal Reserve chair faces criminal investigation while in office. The man responsible for the nation's monetary policy operates under the threat of prosecution by the President's Justice Department. Whatever comes next, that has already happened. And that fact alone, regardless of how the investigation resolves, represents a fundamental change in the relationship between presidential power and central bank independence in the United States. The Federal Reserve was designed to be insulated from political pressure. Today, it faces pressure unlike anything in its 113-year history. How it responds, how markets respond, how Congress and the courts respond, these questions will determine whether the Fed's independence survives this moment or becomes another casualty of an era when institutional norms matter less than they once did. Powell said it himself. Public service sometimes requires standing firm in the face of threats. The weeks and months ahead will reveal whether standing firm is enough or whether the threats he faces mark the beginning of a new chapter in American monetary policy, one where the independence that made the Federal Reserve effective becomes a relic of a different time. That's the question now hanging over the American economy. It's a question that affects anyone with a mortgage, a retirement account, a savings balance, or a stake in economic stability. And it remains, as of this moment, unanswered. The investigation continues. Powell remains at his post. Markets remain on edge. And the precedent, the simple fact that this is happening at all, has already been set. What follows from here will shape American economic governance for years to come. Whether it strengthens institutional independence or weakens it, whether it reinforces norms or further erodes them, whether it's remembered as an aberration or the start of something worse, all of that remains to be determined. But the machinery is now in motion. The subpoenas have been served, the lines have been drawn, and everyone from Wall Street to Main Street is watching to see what happens when the most powerful central banker in the world finds himself in the crosshairs of the most powerful political office in the world. That confrontation, its resolution and its aftermath, will tell us a great deal about what kind of country America is becoming, and whether the institutions that have sustained its economic strength for generations can survive the pressures they're currently facing. For now, we wait, we watch, and we remember that what's at stake isn't just Jerome Powell's fate or Donald Trump's preferences. It's the question of whether monetary policy in the United States will remain guided by economic evidence, or whether it will increasingly bend to whoever holds political power at any given moment. That's the question this investigation has forced into the open. It's a question that deserves an answer, and the answer, when it comes, will matter for every American who depends on a stable, functioning economy. The investigation is ongoing, the uncertainty continues, and the stakes could hardly be higher.